This is the fourth lecture I've given at this program. I noticed in each lecture that I've given the number of people in the audience has steadily gotten less. I suppose this isn't a very good sign for me. But
fairly good sign.
Thanks very much for coming. I would have preferred to go to one of the other lectures myself, but I suppose one can't very well do that. Now, I'm going to be talking today about recent books of interest to Austrians. And I'm going to take recent in a rather broad way to mean no earlier than the 20th century. That's recent enough for me. So the first one that I want to mention is one that probably many of you have already read. It's the book by Henry Hazlitt that I think first came out in 1946 called Economics in One Lesson. Hazlitt was an editorial writer for the New York Times and was a very gifted writer. And this is really one of the best ways of introduction to the economic thinking, especially the Austrian approach to economics. What Hazlitt is especially concerned with in the book is to say that many policies that the advocated by supporters of the welfare state and socialism take account only of the immediate consequences of the program. They don't consider the long-term results or what would have happened in the absence of the policy that was being put in. They just take on the immediate results. And he illustrates this in the first chapter by probably the most famous chapter in this very famous book. He talks about the broken window fallacy, and this he's actually gotten from the great 19th century publicist and economist Frederick Bastiat. So what the broken window fallacy is this: imagine that a little boy throws a brick through the window of a candy store. I guess the little boy didn't have enough money for candy, so he thought of a different way of getting the candy. So you'd think ordinarily, you'd say, well, this is a bad thing that's happened because the window's broken, he's damaged the person's property. But supposing one argued, well, it isn't such a bad thing after all, because the owner of the candy store will have to replace the broken window, and in doing that, he'll be spending money on getting the glass, and this will generate income for the glass maker and possibly increase employment. So isn't it actually a good thing, or at least not as bad a thing as one might have thought, that the little boy bashed knocked the window in? Because look at all the good effects this is having. It's generating all this income. Now, as Hazlitt points out, this is taking into account only the immediate consequences of what the little boy has done. Because if you look at you ask yourself, what would have happened had the little boy not thrown the brick through the window? Well, then the candy maker wouldn't have spent the money that he used to replace the glass on replacing the glass, but he would have either spent it on something else or saved it, in which case the bank would lend it to people, in which it would produce investment in that way. So there's no net gain at all in employment or spending by the little boy having broken the window. And in fact, we were right in the first place. What we have is there's a net loss because there's been damage to the glass. We have to spend resources to get us back to where we were in the first place. So what's involved here is that, as I say, Hazlitt's fundamental point is that the policymakers, the people who think that the broken glass is actually, replacing broken glass actually causing prosperity, are not taking into account the full picture. Now, you might think this is a very silly example. No one would possibly say that in the real world that destroying things leads to prosperity. But in fact, recently, Paul Krugman, who's a very eminent economist, said that after the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center, he said, well, at least this is going to be good for the economy, because think of all the money that's going to have to be spent replacing all the damage that was caused by the World Trade Center destruction. So you see, people actually commit this very fallacy. Now, so Hazlitt, as I say, is concerned with the long-term effects of policy. Now, the next book I want to recommend is going on a much broader canvas than Broken Windows, but it's also considering what happens if there's a policy of government intervention. What can this lead to? And this book is the book in 1944 by Friedrich Hayek called The Road to Serfdom. Now, what Hayek was, this I think is an extremely valuable book in understanding one of the key events of the 1930s and 40s, the rise of the National Socialist or Nazi party to power in Germany, and the World War II, which was the result of that rise to power in the conflict between Germany and the other European countries. So really, as you'll see, Hayek is making a point quite similar to Hazlitt, whereas Hazlitt was saying in the broken window example, supporters of government intervention favor programs of spending, don't take account the long-term results of the policies they favor. Hayek in Road to Serfdom is arguing that the way that the Nazi system came to power, what explains it, is really the unintended results, or at least in some cases unintended results, of certain measures of intervention in the economy. Now, what Hayek's fundamental argument in this book, he's going to get, at the time he wrote, one of the dominant interpretations of the rise of the Nazis, the rise of fascism, was this was an attempt by the capitalist class, the businessmen, to repress socialism. They said, according to the people who took this view, such as Franz Neumann in a book I don't recommend called Behemoth. What he said was, well, look, the businessmen see that there's a growing progressive movement of socialists and communists who are threatening to overthrow the capitalist system. So as a result of that, they're going to they turn to dictators who will suppress these dangerous movements against them, and then this accounts for the rise of the Nazis. And supporters of that view said, well, look, the Nazi party was really supported by big business contribution. Now, actually, this turned out to be factually false. The Gerald Fleming did a long study of business investments in political parties in Germany, and it turned out that although the Nazis did receive some support from some business groups, the more democratic parties received much more support, and there was no real major support by big business for the Nazis. But the explanation Hayek gives for the rise of the Nazis to power is this. He says, well, supposing we have a socialist, people try to put into effect a socialist system, well, what's going to happen? We have, inevitably, people won't agree on the proper plan to put into effect. Some people want to produce one thing, others will have completely different ideas of what's to be produced. So there's inevitably going to be a conflict, and if the government tries to put into effect one plan, it'll inevitably have to suppress those who favor different plans. You might say, well, couldn't they just allow free speech in other areas besides a strictly economic plan? But as Hayek argues, you can't in practice make such a separation if you have the government trying to plan the economy. It's going to lead very rapidly to sort of total government control over opinion, and we'll have a dictatorship resulting. And Hayek goes on to argue in the famous chapter 10 of this book, Road to Serfdom, the chapter 10 is called Why the Worst Get on Top, that the personalities will be attracted to this sort of procedure, as I say, this sort of dictatorial procedure where the government will be planning everything, will not be very nice people. They'll be people who will want to control others, who don't mind or actually enjoy suppressing other people. So Hayek has, in contrast to the prevailing interpretation when he wrote, which was that the Nazis had come to power owing to as the tools of big business, argues, I think very convincingly, that that isn't the case, that in fact the Nazis were the result of the socialist planners. This is the inevitable result of socialist planning. And he in various chapters of the book, he quotes very effectively various German socialist writers showing that they knew the possibility of dictatorship, but they readily embraced this. And he shows really, he takes various socialist writers or left-wing writers such as Karl Mannheim, who was a very influential sociologist originally from Hungary, but who lived in Germany, and he compares these with precursors of the Nazis such as Arthur Müller-Vandenbruck and Oswald Spengler, and he shows there's a very strong similarity in the views they had. Now, if one's going to read Road to Serfdom, I think at the same time one needs to read another book that came out in 1944, which is very much supplements and extends Hayek's argument in other areas. And this is the book by von Mises called Omnipotent Government. Now, what Mises does, I think more, Hayek in Road to Serfdom is concerned principally with a certain intellectual trend, how a certain intellectual argument, how the fact that there are inevitable conflicts of value will create strong pressure in a socialist or semi-socialist system toward having the government impose a certain set of values on the whole population, and the result will be dictatorship and tyranny. Now, what Mises is very concerned to do in Omnipotent Government is to show concretely what were the economic measures that led in Germany to the rise of National Socialism. He stresses in the beginning of the book the fact that German capitalism was one where many of the large business interests used the government programs to advance their own goals, principally by having very high tariffs. And by having high tariffs, they would be able to sell goods at home at quite high prices that would be much higher than the world market price for their product. And then abroad they could sell very low prices. They make a lot of money that way. And he argues that this type of cartelization policy led to sort of a system that was quite different from free market capitalism. It was one where we had sort of government dominated, firms, economy dominated by firms that had the patronage of the government. So really, if you look, in his view, if you look at the German economy even before World War I, it was already primed for the aggressive policies that were later to ensue in the 1920s and 30s. And according to Mises, he argues very strongly in this book and in many other books that if the government tries to intervene in the economy, its measures of intervention won't be successful. Say if it tries to impose price control, the price control will fail, and then the government will then be faced with the choice of either ending the original intervention or returning to the free market. It's sort of the intervention isn't going to succeed, so then if the government will then either have to go forward with more intervention or back to the market. And he argued, and he had, I think, in mind in this very much a particular historical case, that if this policy is continued, if the government decides at each step it's going to go ahead with more and more intervention, the result very quickly will be a kind of socialism. And he had in mind especially the fact that in World War I, the German economy was one where the government exercised nearly total control through the so-called Hindenburg Plan, that all prices and wages and costs were determined by the government. So this was sort of a path to socialism, according to Mises, other than one where you have an official socialist policy where the government takes over the means of production directly. This is one where you had an indirect sort of a socialism keeping the name of capitalism, where there's ostensibly private owners who are still in charge, but really the government is in control because it's telling everyone what the appropriate prices and wages are supposed to be. So this is really a form of socialism. And Mises argues that the Nazis during the 1930s and 40s had exactly this same type of socialism in effect. He says the managers of the plants were really agents of the government. They weren't private owners or employees of the stockholders. They were really agents of the government. So he comes up with an explanation for National Socialism that's very much which it is really a variety of socialism. It isn't, as the opponents of capitalism contended, the Nazi system isn't a type of extreme capitalism, or capitalism with the gloves off, as some of the communists thought, but it's in fact a type of socialism. Now, as I say, if you read Road to Serfdom and Omnipotent Government together, I think you get a very good picture of this crucial episode in 20th century history. One book I would recommend also, I don't mean to concentrate entirely on this one episode, although I think it is very good in trying to understand Austrian economics, to take a very important historical phenomenon such as the rise of the Nazis, or as I'll talk about a little bit later on, the depression of the 1929 and 1930s, and try to read a number of books on this so one can get an understanding of this event from the Austrian point of view. I think this is a good way not only to understand the event concerned, but to understand something about the distinctively Austrian approach. So I would also recommend a book with a very similar thesis to that of Hayek and Mises, a book by the American journalist John T. Flynn, which also came out in 1944, called The Road Ahead. And he makes a very similar argument to Hayek and Mises, showing how measures of government intervention lead to very rapidly to a full-scale socialist system. And he has many applications to the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, and he's very concerned that if the policies of the New Deal are kept in play, that America may be going down the road to fascism. Now, I mentioned Hayek's Road to Serfdom. Now, one of the points Hayek develops in the book is when he says that the government will, because of conflicts of values, will have to impose its own plan on the economy and suppress competing plans. He's very concerned to contrast what he thinks this is the bad way of doing things, that the government is just acting in arbitrary ways, imposing its own values. He's concerned to contrast this with what he thinks is the appropriate type of law or legislation, which is one, according to Hayek, one of general rules, where the general rules that the government enacts don't mention specific people or classes of people. Just, according to Hayek, the proper rule of law is one in which the laws give state certain general policies the government will follow, so that people are free to plan their actions knowing these general policies, and they'll find that they don't have to be afraid the government is going to come after them and interfere with what particular things they're going to do, as long as they observe the general regulation. I think there's some problems with this, but it's a very important concept, this Hayek's notion of the rule of law. And I think if you're interested in pursuing what Hayek means by the rule of law further than what he says in the Road to Serfdom, which is intended as a popular book. One needs to look at his book in 1960, a very long book called The Constitution of Liberty, in which he elaborates in great deal his notion of the rule of law. I think there's some problems with this book, Constitution of Liberty. Hayek tended to allow a great many measures of government intervention in the economy that strict proponents of laissez-faire would think are improper. I remember a friend of mine who was not too keen on Hayek always used to point out that if you look at page 190 of the Constitution of Liberty, you'll find that Hayek says that the Supreme Court shouldn't have overturned Roosevelt's New Deal measures as unconstitutional. I checked the page, and it turns out that Hayek did say that. But in spite of this and other points, I think this book is still much worth going into because of its analysis of the rule of law. Now, I should mention also, as one of the points Hayek mentions in Road to Serfdom, as I said, is that the government planners tend to assume total control over the people. They'll say, because there are all these conflicting value judgments on what we should do, we're going to impose our own values on everyone else. And the mentality that underlying this sort of approach, that people are really inferiors to be experimented on by the government, who's the elite, who's going to impose the true values, according to Hayek, really stem from certain type of scientific mentality or engineering mentality, in which scientists or engineers are considered as if they're experimenting on people. And Hayek, in a book called The Counter-Revolution of Science, traced this scientific approach to the French École Polytechnique, which is a leading French school for training engineers and scientists in the 19th century. This is an extremely valuable historical study that I think, if you're reading Road to Serfdom, you might want to supplement your reading of that with this other book by Hayek. Well, supposing one's gotten through all these books on the rise of the National Socialism, principally the Omnipotent Government and Road to Serfdom. Now I think we need to now confront directly the outstanding 20th century Austrian economists. And I'll start with the person who's the greatest of all Austrian economists in the 20th century, Ludwig von Mises. I'm sure in the week you've been here, this name will have come up once or twice. All right, now, I want to mention first the four great books of Mises. Now, the one I would recommend starting with, sometimes, although Mises had a very clear style, sometimes students find it a bit difficult, but the one I would recommend starting with is the last one of these four books that he wrote, which was Theory and History, which came out in 1957. In this one, he gives his account of how the historical method, how does the historian use praxeology, the deductive science of economics, in explaining explaining particular historical events. But one thing I would single out in this book that's, I think, especially important, that is his brilliant analysis of the Marxist theory of history. And now what, according to the way Mises conceives of Marxism, that Marx held that the course of history, the fundamental determinant of course of history, is the growth in the forces of production. By forces of production, he meant something like the technology available at the time. He said you can go from the earliest stage where people just had very primitive stone tools, and you can see throughout history there's been an increasing trend toward more and more complex technology. And according to Marx, as technology grows, various social systems become best suited at these particular times to develop technology to the greatest extent possible. Say, in the ancient history, a slave system would best develop technology. So later on, the feudal system would best develop technology, and now it's capitalism that best develops technology. Eventually, this will all be capitalism be overthrown. We'll have a socialist system that will bring history as we've known it so far to an end. In each of these systems, the slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, is characterized by class conflict, where a class is a particular group of people who have a certain relation to the forces of production, as Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. So you see, Marx says that really the function of each society, of each type of society, is to advance the forces of production. But after a certain length of time, the particular type of economic system will no longer advance the forces of production. It'll then be a break on these forces, and that system will then be overthrown by revolutionary means until another system replaces it that will then be advance the force of production more. So he says this again will end when capitalism is replaced by socialism, which will bring to an end the process of class conflict. Now, Mises strikes at the heart of the Marxist system in Theory and History. He points out that Marx is assuming that the forces of production are some kind of independent entity that are just growing by themselves. But according as Mises is very effectively argued in Human Action and other works, only individuals can act. How can Marx assume that the force of production is some kind of entity that is acting by itself, that people really have no choice as to how they're whether they want to increase the force of production? Now, this is some kind of independent force, is just going automatically, and then the social system has to adjust to it. And Mises also has argued in his works that the capitalist system is always the one that best develops the forces of production. So why should we think that at various times in the past slavery has been the system that's best suited to develop the force of production, or feudalism at another time has best developed the force of production? This is false. It's always capitalism that best develops the productive system. So the whole basis of the system, the Marxist system, collapses. I should mention in this connection that in this I'm going to violate my rule that I was going to confine myself to 20th century works. After all, it's my rule, and I suppose free to violate. I also want to mention, as long as we're concerned, as long as on the topic of refutations of Marxism, I think everyone should read the chapter of the great boehm-bawerk's book, Capital and Interest, the chapter of Volume 2 that's concerned with Karl Marx. Also, I think part of the chapter is concerned with Rodbertus, who was another socialist theorist who's fortunately long sunk into oblivion. But in the chapter that boehm-bawerk devotes to Marx, he really demolishes completely the whole Marxist theoretical edifice. His principal argument against Marx is this, that according to Marx, in the first volume of Das Kapital, Marx's great work on economics, which first volume came out in 1867, Marx had a model in which commodities exchange according to the socially necessary labor power required to produce them. But Marx was constrained to admit later on that this doesn't at all correspond to the actual prices on the market of goods, that goods don't in fact exchange according to these particular labor values that Marx's model said they should. Now Marx said, well, this really isn't a problem. This is in his later volume 3 of the book, which was published after his death by Friedrich Engels. Marx said he can derive these actual price of production from the labor prices. He can show that given the labor prices, as postulated in volume 1, he can derive these other prices, the actual prices, that are on the market. So in fact, his system really, labor system really is consistent with the actual price on the capitalist economy. But boehm-bawerk showed that Marx's attempt failed, that there's a complete, that his model doesn't explain capitalist prices at all. And in so doing, he really demolished totally the Marxist system. Boehm-bawerk wrote another work, a separate work, which has been published under the title Karl Marx and the Close of His System, in which you can read the same argument in another forum. So I say theory and history is valuable not only for its refutation of Marxism, but this is certainly one of the things we can get from it. Now, the next book I want to recommend is probably, I said Mises is the most important 20th century economist. Now, probably his most important book, or certainly the most important book he wrote, was his great work, originally came out in 1949, called Human Action. Now, this really is, if I had to mention one book, say if I, instead of talking about recent books of interest to Austrians, I just had to confine myself to one book, this would certainly be the book. Many students find it extremely difficult, especially the first 140 so pages on economic method. It's nevertheless, even though parts of it are difficult, it's nevertheless, I think, one that you really need to read to understand the Austrian economic approach. This is really the great masterwork. Now, among the highlights of the book are this. First of all, economists in the 19th century and earlier had reasoned in a deductive way, but Mises was really systematized and extended the notion of economic method that previous economists such as Ricardo and Nassau Sr. had used. And what Mises tried to do is, I'm sure you've heard in previous lectures, is that he thought from the axiom of action, namely the principle that human beings act, plus some supplementary postulates, he could deduce the entire science of economics. So what he, in effect, saying is, or what he actually is saying is, that in contrast to the method in the physical sciences where what's done is the scientist will come up with a certain hypothesis and then try to test it. He'll try to see, he'll say, he assumes, say, that the pressure of a gas varies in a certain way with its volume, and then he'll try to test this as, is this law that he's postulated true? According to Mises, in economics we don't do that. We can deduce the laws directly from the axiom of action, and we don't need to test them, which is fortunate because in Mises' view there's so many variables, so human action is so varied, there are constant actions that we would be unable to test economic law. So it's fortunate we can't perform the test, but we don't have to because we can arrive at the laws of economics deductively. Now, Mises, in the book, addresses all sorts of particular issues. I just want to point out one section of the book that I think has not been studied, or a couple sections I don't think have received enough attention. One is, and this I perhaps put out of order, but in an earlier book, which I'll be discussing shortly, Mises developed a very famous argument against socialism, where he said that a socialist system would be unable to calculate economically. In order to have a developed economy, we need to have a price system, and we can only have this price system under capitalism. Now, there were various socialist writers, as Mises, I think, characteristically says, some socialist writers, in his phrase, conversant with economics, who argue, no, a socialist system can also have economic calculation because it could use certain mathematical equations of equilibrium, to calculate what the prices were that should prevail on the market. So really, according to these socialists, the system of prices, for efficient prices, are the same under socialism and capitalism. There isn't really there isn't a problem of calculation for socialism any more than there is one for capitalism. Both systems use the same equilibrium equations. Then other socialists, such as Oscar Lange, who was a professor at the University of Chicago, was a Marxist. After the communists came to power in Poland after World War II, he left the University of Chicago and assumed a post in the Polish communist government. But he said the socialists could solve the calculation problem by really allowing a market in consumers' commodities, and the government would control some of the higher stages of production, but we could have a consumer's market. In this way, you could get prices on the market, on the socialist market, so you could have kind of a socialist system imitating a capitalist system. Now, the part of human action I think has been neglected is Mises replies to all these criticisms. He shows that the differential equations that are used by the mathematical economists really don't have any relevance to the dynamic economy. These are supposed to be ones that are just giving a certain static equilibrium picture. But Mises says, well, the important thing is how do we get to equilibrium? We're never actually going to get there. So these equations really aren't important. We're always in process toward equilibrium, and that fact is not dealt with by these equations. And he has other arguments against the attempt by the various people such as Oscar Lange and Fred Taylor, Abel Lerner, and others to come up with so-called models of market socialism. Now, the other part of human action that I'll mention, this is just there's also an enormous number of interesting ideas in human action. Anytime one reads the book, one can always come up with new material. But one thing that I don't think has been followed up at all, maybe people who are interested in the business cycle theory might want to go into this, is that Mises gives in various places in human action some criticism of Friedrich Hayek's views on the business cycle. Friedrich Hayek is the most famous developer of Austrian business cycle theory. You remember in the Austrian account of business cycles, there's the government causes an expansion in bank credit, and this lowers the rate of interest, the money rate of interest, below the natural rate of interest, which is determined by time preference. As a result of when the government stops expanding bank credit, then there'll be return to the natural rate of interest, other things being equal, and the investment in the higher stages of production is taking place because of this extra availability of bank credit will have to be liquidated. So this is painting very broad brushes, the Austrian theory of the cycle. It was developed very extent by Friedrich Hayek in his book Prices and Production and other works. But Mises, although he's in basic agreement with Hayek, gives some important criticism. For example, Hayek has one footnote, for example, where he attacks Hayek on the so-called Ricardo effect, which involves a substitution of machinery for labor under various circumstances. And some of these points that he criticizes on Hayek are quite technical points that I confess are far beyond me, but I think if anyone's interested in this, this would be a very good topic to investigate on what Mises' particular criticisms of Hayek in Human Action. Now, I mentioned so far two of the four great books that Mises' four greatest books. Now, the other two are first the Theory of Money and Credit, which was Mises' earliest great book. I think came out around 1912 in German. And one of the contributions here was many writers had claimed that money is completely dependent on the state. The state could just declare certain things to be money and that was it. Government money is completely state created. But Mises showed here, developing certain insights of Karl Menger, that this is not the case, that money has to arise as the result of as a commodity, from a commodity in this way, that we can imagine this starting off with a barter system in which people are just exchanging goods against goods. Then certain goods will be sought after by actors on the market because they'll be likely to be accepted by everyone else in exchange. Say if I had to depend on, if we were in a barter system, I would have to find people who want to hear my lectures if I wanted to get any money. I wouldn't be able to do very well at that. Look how badly I'm doing already. So in a system where we have, but supposing there's some good that I know that everybody will want, then if I can get hold of that, I'll find it much easier to make exchanges. So according to Mises, money developed in this way. If we didn't have money developing out of a commodity, if we just had the government hand out certain pieces of paper and say, okay, this is money, we wouldn't know how to value those pieces of paper. It's only if we have money first developing out of commodities that we can have an account of how money can get its value in relation to other goods. And Mises showed, in a way that I won't go into now, that a certain problem of circularity that seems involved in this argument can really be solved. This is called the famous money regression theorem. Now, the last of the four great books was one I mentioned already in talking about, referred to in talking about socialist calculation argument. This is the famous book of 1922 called Socialism, where Mises developed the argument that I've already mentioned, namely that if we had a socialist system, in the sense, defining that as one in which the government owns the means of production, controls the means of production, it would be unable to function economically. Why is that? Well, in any kind of economic system, we have to, in production, we have a choice. We always are faced with choices of what to do with various resources. Say, should we use steel in the, say, production of steel plants that will be used to make various things, or should we use steel, say, for, should dentists use steel rather for teeth, or should we use other parts of steel? How much steel should we use for people who have to have steel plates in their heads? We have all sorts of decisions that we have to raise for each commodity about how that should be allocated. And we can't do this on a purely technological basis. We have to value one thing against another. We have to say, would it be more valuable to use this commodity this way rather than that way? So Mises argues that we can only make such decisions. We have some sort of common measure. We can determine it would be more valuable to use a resource in one way than another. And Mises shows very effectively that only if we have a price system, only have a system of prices, can we make these decisions. Otherwise, we'll just have the planner will be faced with all sorts of information piling up on him. He'll say, well, I know if I use so many tons of steel here and combine this with this other thing here, I'll get this commodity, this resulting, and have all sorts of production functions giving him formulas for various things, but he won't be able to use them in any coherent form. He can only apply the information that he has if he's able to reduce this information to some sort of common denominator of having a price system. If he can't do that, there'd be total chaos. And Mises goes on to say that only under capitalism can we have such a price system. Now, Mises, Hayek points this out later on, although some socialists later criticized Mises using some of the arguments I mentioned before that Mises refutes in Human Action. Really, Mises was the complete victor in the debate in this sense that everyone at all acquainted with economic thought had to admit that he was right, that without some sort of without a price system, there couldn't be any economic calculation. This hadn't been realized by socialists before. They just taught very vaguely about some sort of planning in terms of labor units, or they really hadn't considered the problem at all. But once Mises wrote his basic article in 1920 on calculation in a socialist state, which was expanded into the 1922 book, really everybody had to recognize that he was right. There could be no economic calculation under a socialist system, defining socialist system as it had been before. The ones who replied to Mises really had to concede his point and say, well, maybe we can have some sort of socialist system that incorporates a price system. But in doing that, they were changing the whole concept of socialism. No previous socialist had thought that we had to have a socialist system, had to have a price system at all. This was, in fact, they didn't like price systems. They thought this was really having money as kind of an alien, as part of the alienating effects of capitalism, whatever that's supposed to mean. But they were against calculation completely. They thought socialism would just produce a total abundance and we wouldn't need to be involved with calculation altogether. So Mises completely changed the terms of the debate by his fundamental argument in his 1920 article in his book, Socialism. Now, after mentioning Mises, I'd like to mention a few books by one of Mises' students, whom I'm sure most of you have heard of, Murray Rothbard. Now, I want to mention first Rothbard's two-volume book, Man, Economy, and State, which came out in 1962. This is, I think, is one that people would find very profitable reading. I remember when I was in, I think I had just started junior high school. This came out in 1962, and I remember getting it right away. I was very excited to get it and read it, and it made a big impression on me. And I think people disagreed with various parts of the book, but it's an extremely valuable book to read. One of the valuable things in it, I think, is this, that Rothbard claims that the calculation problem, this economic calculation problem, the one I just talked about in connection with Mises' book on socialism, isn't completely an argument about socialism. We could have versions of this same problem under capitalism in this way. Supposing we imagine all the firms under capitalism were joined together in one big firm. We had one big cartel that controlled the whole economy. Then we'd have the same problem of calculation that we had under socialism. So the key to the calculation problem is we have to have independent firms that are setting prices in order to have a price system. We couldn't have just one big firm that was calculating, that was attempting to produce everything. So according to Rothbard, this raises limits to the extent to which a firm can increase its size on the market, that if it gets too big, it might find it's unable to, it'll encounter certain difficulties in economic calculation. So this is one argument against the Marxist claim that capitalism leads to a system of universal monopoly. Now, another thing we find in Rothbard's book is a criticism of the view that a monopoly price can arise on the free market. According to Rothbard, monopoly prices can only come about if the government grants someone or some group of people special privilege that they're the only ones allowed to sell a particular commodity. He thinks that otherwise we can't distinguish between a competitive price and a monopoly price. And I recommend his argument there to those who are interested in monopoly theory. I mentioned before when I was talking about human action, the Austrian theory of the business cycle. And I think in this connection, a very good book to read is another one by Rothbard called America's Great Depression. It came out in 1963. And this, in the first part of the book, Rothbard discusses the Austrian theory of the cycle and then compares it with various other theories such as the Keynesian theory and the one given by Joseph Schumpeter. And then he shows that how the Austrian theory, having done that and explained the Austrian theory, comparing it with the critics, he then applies the Austrian theory to the events of the financial policy in the 1920s, culminating in the crash of October 1929 and the first few years of the Great Depression. And what Rothbard argues, I think very successfully, is that the Federal Reserve during the 1920s followed an inflationary policy. So this led into just the sort of bank credit expansion that I've mentioned that is essential in understanding how the Austrian theory conceives of boom. There's been an expansion in bank credit that lowers the rate of interest below the natural rate determined by time preference. And when this process stops, say there was a big contraction of the money supplied by the Federal Reserve System in 1929, the result then is that these overinvestments become liquidated and we have a depression. And one thing also Rothbard points out in that book is that the contrast that's sometimes drawn between Herbert Hoover as the supporter of laissez-faire capitalism and Franklin Roosevelt as the New Dealer who wanted to really replace capitalism with kind of mixed system is overdrawn in the sense that Hoover turns out to have been one who favored a great deal of government intervention himself. So in the last book I want to mention by Rothbard is the History of Economic Thought in 2 volumes. And this has there's an enormous amount of important material in here. First of all, his stress on the Spanish Scholastics. He argues that in contrast to the standard view that Adam Smith was the founder of economics, Rothbard says that no, the Spanish Scholastics really had the idea of a marginal utility theory, the subjective nature of economic value, long before Smith, and that Smith really, in at least in respect to value theory, was a regressive step in that he went back to a labor or cost theory of value. And also in that same book, Rothbard gives a very interesting account of the intellectual history of Marxism, showing how it developed some of the Marxist ideas parallel the idea of certain religious heresies in the Middle Ages and Reformation period. This is really a very important contribution to intellectual history. Now I'll finish up with just two more books. One is, in considering the Austrian approach to the business cycle, we have to, I think, contrast this with the main competing school, the Keynesian economic system, one that, in contrast to the Austrian approach, leads to a policy of government intervention. And a book I would recommend here is one by Henry Hazlitt. Remember the author of the first book I recommended, The Economics in One Lesson. And this book is The Failure of the New Economics. And what Hazlitt does is to take Keynes's a famous book, General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. He goes through it really paragraph by paragraph, sometimes line by line, showing what's wrong with the arguments that Keynes gives. And in doing so, he performs a very difficult task of explaining Keynes in clear English. So you not only get to see what's wrong with Keynes's argument, you actually see what Keynes is saying. And Hazlitt brings out the fact that Keynes's view was that, in contrast to what free market economists had generally said, that unemployment in a depression or anywhere, anytime else for that matter, is caused by wage rates being fixed higher than the market price of labor. Keynes said, well, lowering wage rates in a depression is not the right course of action. Really, what's required is for the government to increase consumer spending through inflation or other means of raising prices. So according to Hazlitt, this is what the effect of this is really to lower real wages. So Keynes really hasn't contradicted the classical analysis. He's just trying to get around it. He's just saying, well, we can't in practice get workers to accept lower wages, so we'll kind of trick them by raising prices and they'll have lower real wages. So according to Hazlitt, Keynes really hasn't come up with the sort of theoretical innovation he's claimed to have. It really, according to Hazlitt, he says nothing, I think something like this, he says, nothing in the Keynes's general theory is both original and true. Rather not too favorable a comment. Now, the last book I'll mention is one I had to do something that I don't like doing. I had to write a favorable review of this particular book. This is something, if you look at my magazine, I very much dislike doing. But it's the book by George Reisman, who I see is out in the audience, is Capitalism. This is a gigantic book. It's about 1,000 pages, but each of the pages is double size, so it's about twice the size of Human Action. But I think this has some extremely valuable insights that are not available elsewhere. Now, I'll mention two in particular. One is that, as I mentioned before, in the Austrian view, the rate of interest is determined by time preference, the preference people have for present goods over future goods. But I think Reisman argues very effectively that the time preference that's relevant in determining the interest rate is really the time preference of capitalists as determined by their desires for consumption goods over how much they want to invest. According to his account, really economists tend to stress consumer spending too much, whereas they ignore the fact there's enormously complex structure of production, and the transactions that take place among the various higher stages of production apart from the consumers is really the key to understanding the developed capitalist economy. And I think if one understands this point, one sees we have a crucial point against the Keynesian system, because Keynes stressed very much failures, the importance of keeping up consumer spending to prevent depression. If there was a depression, he said, well, we have to increase consumer spending, otherwise there'll be a complete collapse of the economy. But according to Reisman's analysis, this isn't the case, that we really have to, it's really the transactions among the higher stage of production that are of overwhelming importance. And the other insight is, I think, one that I hadn't seen in previous works, although it's an area I'm very greatly interested in, is in the criticism of Marxism. According to Marx, profit arises out of exploitation of labor, in the sense that the workers under capitalism aren't receiving the full value of what they produce. They're getting what the cost is to produce them, namely the labor, what's required to feed or support the laborer and his family. The laborer is able to produce more than that, and that part, the surplus value, goes to the capitalist. Now, Reisman points out that this argument assumes that the real source of economic value is in wages. So we start off with labor who receives wages, and then profit is extracted from the wages. The wages, the labor doesn't get the full value of what he produces, but the capitalist takes some of it away. Now, the point that is the innovation in capitalism is that it's held that the capitalist income is really the original source of value, that wages are really paid out of what the capitalist first produces, in the sense that, supposing somebody starts off just independently producing, he wouldn't be a laborer in the sense that he's someone working for someone else. He would be a capitalist who would be embarking on some kind of economic venture, so that according to this model, is developed very elaborate detail in the book, that the capitalist is really the source of value, and wages are a deduction from what the capitalist produces, rather than the other way around, as the Marxists contend. So I think, I see we're out of time now, so I think these are a few books, at any rate, that I think one might find helpful.